Hello everybody. Welcome to the 2024 presidential election map prediction. Today is November 4th, 2024. Election day is tomorrow. What I'm going to be doing here today is analyzing the 7 key swing states that ultimately decide this election. Now, I could go by state, but what I'm going to do is assume all of these states that are shaded already in red or blue are going to go the way they are, right? They're pretty, unless something crazy happens, they're pretty predictable. Though that's pretty much what's going to happen as far as the states already shaded in. Democrats will have 226, Republicans will have 219, with 7 states remaining. Now, these 7 states that aren't shaded in either red or blue, right, have polled the closest, they've been the most unpredictable, and ultimately, those 7 states decide the election. What I'm going to do is go by state, and with my own interpretation of previous polling data on each state and previous election history in each state since 2020 and 2016, I'm going to make a most accurate guess on how each of the 7 swing states that decide this election are going to play out. So what we're going to do here is, like I said, 226 for Democrats, 219 for Republicans, of course, Harris versus Trump. We're going to start with Georgia. Now, Georgia was the second closest state last election. It has 16 electoral votes. That's tied with the second most of the swing states with North Carolina. So it's an important state. So let's take a look on how Georgia did in 2020. 2020, Joe Biden won the state of Georgia by just 11,700 votes. It was the second closest state of that election. He won it by just 0.23%. Now, really close already. It was the second closest state. Let's look at what happened since 2020, since Biden won it by 11,000 votes last election. In 2022 midterms, there was a governor race in Georgia. Brian Kemp, the governor, ran for re-election, and in that, he won by a pretty good amount, the Republican. He won by just about 300,000 votes. That's a good sign for Republicans, because Brian Kemp in 2018, when he ran the first time for governor in Georgia, he didn't beat Stacey Abrams. He faced her twice. He didn't beat her by that much. Now, they faced off again 2 years ago, and he won by a pretty good amount, 300,000 votes, or 8% of a victory, right? Versus Biden, 0.3%. So that, or 0.23%, right? So that's a big improvement for Republicans since 2020. Now, they also won a senator race down there as well, right, in 2022, so that's a good sign. But here's what's also a good sign for Republicans and Donald Trump in Georgia. In terms of polling, right, on average so far, one day before the election, Trump has a lead over Harris in Georgia in the polling by, on average, 0.7%. Now, it's not that much, right, but it's good news because typically the polls underestimate Trump. We don't know if it's going to happen again this time, but on average, that's the second, I believe it's the third or second best polling average for Donald Trump in the 7 swing states, a 0.7% lead. Here's something to keep in mind. In 2020 with the polls in Georgia, right, Joe Biden had a 1.2% lead on average on election day, right? And he won by just 0.2%. So it was pretty accurate with Georgia polls, and he ultimately underestimated Trump a little bit in the end, right? It had Biden winning by 1.2%. He still won, but by 0.2%. So, if anything, it was accurate. It underestimated Trump just a little bit. So, those are good signs for Trump in Georgia. But here's one more really good sign for Trump in Georgia, right? Well, first, before we get there, Georgia's election history. They've gone red every election since 1996, except for 2020. I think 2020 was more of a fluke in Georgia. Again, Biden won it by just 11,000 votes. Since then, polling, governor races, Senate races, everything's showing it's going to go back to Trump and the Republicans, which Trump won in 2016 by a good amount as well. And the last thing I want to show you for Georgia is early voting. Early voting in Georgia is huge because out of all the states with early vote, right, Georgia, almost half its registered voters have already voted, just about. The most in any state of this election, right? And registered Republicans, have a 3% lead over registered Democrats. That's huge because last time in 2020, Joe Biden, or I should say Democrats, registered Democrats had it was a 4% lead almost in Georgia for registered Democrats over Republicans. So pretty much it's a total flip this time around. So Republicans are doing very good in the early vote, better than last time. Last time the registered Democrats had lead in Georgia. This time it's Republicans. And another big thing to watch in Georgia is Georgia is Atlanta, Fulton County. That they decide the election. There's a heavy black vote in Atlanta, Georgia. They ultimately decide the election because Trump's been polling very well among black voters in Georgia. They ultimately get it done. They've been doing much better. So polling, election history, and registered voters so far in turnout is looking good for Trump and the Republicans in Georgia. So what I'm going to do is pretty much make a safe call here for Georgia, as I think it will go for Donald Trump and the Republicans 16 electoral votes. Now, what we're going to do here is next go to Arizona, because Arizona is a very similar tune to Georgia. 11 electoral votes. Let's go to Arizona. Now, what happened in 2020 in Arizona? Joe Biden won again by just 11,000 votes. Georgia was the second closest in 2020. Arizona was the closest. He won it by just, actually, it was 10,500 votes in Arizona, and Joe Biden won Georgia by 11,700. So the two closest states of the election, right? And he won it by just, again, 0.3%. Now, let's do the same thing with Georgia. What's happened since 2020 when Joe Biden barely won it? Now, in terms of polling, Trump's been doing the best in Arizona. As far as the 7 swing states, Arizona, Trump's been polling the best at 2.2% on average. That's a lot given this election cycle. And let's look at 2020. 2020, polling-wise, Joe Biden had a 3% edge, right? He ended up winning. He had a 3% edge on average in the polling. He ended up winning, but by just 0.3%. They underestimated Trump again by 3%. This time around, Donald Trump has almost a 3% lead in the polls. So those are good signs, very good signs for Donald Trump. Now, what else is there to look at? Let's look at the Arizona early vote, which is pretty crazy. Republicans, as you can see here, in 2020, were trailing registered Democrats in early voting a couple days before the election by 0.4%. In 2024, they have an 8% lead over registered Democrats before the election, or a few days before the election. This is a few days old. And in 2020, right, 56% of independents, that's the yellow here, voted for Joe Biden. And 44%, the rest of them voted for Donald Trump, or I think it was 46 to 43, something along those lines. If you do that same math in 2024 with the registered independents voting, Donald Trump still wins. The early vote, right, they are up by 8% coming into this election versus last time they were losing. That's huge. Arizona has been showing up in the early vote. So, because they're just, registered Republicans are doing the best by far in Arizona, and it's just, that's crazy. That's a crazy lead as far as registered voting in the early vote. So, I think Georgia and Arizona are the safest calls to make for Donald Trump. They're the safest calls to make as far as the swing states. So, let's go ahead, right, and move Arizona to Trump, and that brings him to 246. He flips 2 states, right? Again, Arizona, I don't think I have it up here, but Arizona is the same thing as Georgia. Arizona also, like Georgia, has voted red since 1992, except in 2020, Georgia went blue, Arizona went blue. They've both been red since 1992, and in 2020, they just barely lost. Biden won Georgia by 11,000, Biden won Arizona by 10,000. I think there were flukes, right? Since then, Trump's been polling the best, right, in those states. He's won elections, or Republicans have won elections in those states, and the early vote in Arizona is looking very good for Republicans, so it's safe to say they'll go back to red. They've been red since 1992, just 2020, they barely went blue. So, that's 2 down. We're going to move to Nevada. Nevada and its 6 electoral votes. Now, Nevada's been blue since 2004. Trump has never won it, but he's on track to win it for the first time, and Republicans are on track to win it for the first time since 2004. Here's why. Let's take a look at 2020. Biden won by a good amount. He won by, 35,000 votes, right? Which isn't that much, but he won it by 3%. That's what does it, right? 3%, that's a good amount, right? So that's what happened last time. In 2016, it was a little closer, but that's what happened last time. Let's take a look at what happened since, right? So it's kind of close, but still a comfortable lead for Democrats, right? But in 2022, this happened. In 2022, in Nevada, there was a governor race where, again, Republicans won by, it was close, but by 1%, right? By, 16,000 votes, Joe Lombardo won that. Now, let's take a look at polling. If we take a look at polling, Trump has a lead there by 0.3%. Now, this is what's huge here. Let's take a look at 2020. On average, Joe Biden had a 5% lead on average in the polls in 2020 in Nevada. He won, but only by around 3, right? They underestimated Trump again. This time around, Trump's up by less than 1%, but if you look at the polls, if you look at the governor race since 2020, the signs are showing Trump again. Now, this is the most important thing. Again, the early vote. Let's look at the early vote. This is huge. In 2020, Republicans, or I should say registered Democrats, had about a 45,000 vote lead heading into Election Day. Democrats had a 45,000 vote lead. This time around, vice versa. Republicans have a 45,000 vote lead. It was around 43, 44 for Democrats. It's around that same today. This was a couple days ago. It kind of shrank to 43 today, I believe, for registered Republicans. But the exact opposite. Joe Biden won it by, 30,000 votes? And they had a 45,000 vote lead heading into the election. Now Republicans have a 45,000 vote lead heading into the election. It's going to be really close. It's not going to be as close to Arizona and Georgia, I think. But based off what we know, it's going to be close. But the early vote is looking very strong for Republicans. So again, Donald Trump is going to take Nevada. He's going to take 3 so far of 7 swing states. So now that brings him to 252 with 4 remaining, right? North Carolina, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin. 252, 226. Now, let's move on to the next state. The next state of North Carolina. North Carolina, 16 electoral votes. Again, tied with Georgia for the most out of the 7 swing states, right? Donald Trump won it in 2020, but just barely. Just barely. He won it by less than, or a little over 1%, right? He won it by about 75,000 votes. Now, a state where almost 6 million people vote, 5 million people vote, by just, 70,000 votes, that's not a lot. By 1%, that's not a lot. Let's take a look at what happened since then, right? Polling. Take a look at polling. This election cycle, pretty comfortable for Trump. Percentage, 1.2% on average lead for Trump. Now, let's look at 2020. With polling again, same thing. Joe Biden had an average of 2.5% heading into the election lead in North Carolina. What happened? Trump ended up winning. They underestimated Trump here by around 3 to 4 points, 3 to 4 percentage points. That's huge. They underestimated Trump in the polls there. He's up in the polls this time. Now, let's take a look at early voting. Well, first, actually, let's take a look at this. Same thing almost with Georgia and Arizona, North Carolina, right? North Carolina is always red. It's always red. 2008, Obama won it, right? I think that was kind of more of a fluke, right? And then Mitt Romney took it back. It's always red, right? It's going to be close, but it's always ultimately red. And let's look at early voting. Early voting tells us, right? It's going to be Trump again. I actually don't have it up. But the early voting tells us that's going to be Trump because North Carolina, this time around, with the early vote, it's tied in the percentage. I could do this, actually. Let's go here. Let's go to North Carolina. It's just about tied. Actually, Republicans have a 2% lead registered in the early vote. What's significant about that is it was the other way around in 2020. Registered Democrats in 2020 had around a 4% lead heading into Election Day in North Carolina. This time around, Republicans have a 2% lead. North Carolina usually always goes red. He's polling great in there. He won it in 2016. He won it in 2020. Trump's looking good there to win it a third time with the early votes looking good for them as well, right? So what we're going to do is now put North Carolina for Donald Trump, 16 electoral votes. He just needs one more swing state to win. But first, let's go to Michigan. Michigan and its 15 electoral votes, right? So let's go to Michigan. Let's find that here. In 2016, Donald Trump won Michigan, right? But just barely. He won it by, 0.23%. 0.23%. He won it by just, 9,000 votes or 11,000 votes, 11,000 votes in 2016, a state where almost 5 million people voted. That's nothing. So it was a very small, it actually took weeks to call Michigan in 2016. He barely won it. Now, what happened in 2020? As far as the swing states go, in 2020, this was the most decisive victory. Joe Biden won it by 150,000 votes. As far as the 7 swing states this election cycle, this was the biggest margin of victory last time. Joe Biden won Michigan by 150,000 votes, 3%. That's a lot to overcome. Let's take a look at the polls since then. If we take a look at the polls since then, right? Harris has the lead, right? Harris has the lead pretty consistently this election cycle in Michigan by just 0.8% up until today, right? However, something to watch. In 2020, Joe Biden had an 8% lead in the polls on average, right? He ended up winning, what was that, by 3%? That underestimated Trump and Trump voters by 5%. That's a lot, but considering Michigan is the most liberal out of all the swing states, right? The margin of victory in 2020, right, for Joe Biden, and in 2016 Trump barely winning it, it's safe to say Michigan's going to go blue, especially when it's been blue since 1992, right? Michigan's been blue since 1988, except when Trump won it in 2016 and he barely won it. It's safe to say Michigan's blue because it's the bluest state out of the 7 swing states. So let's go ahead now and give Michigan to Kamala Harris, Vice President Harris, and it's 15 electoral votes. And now, with 2 states left, it's 268 to 241. Now, those 4 states, or I should say, those 5 states that I called, they're kind of more predictable than these next 2. These next 2 are the hardest states to call, but let's do it. Pennsylvania, the state that will decide this election, 19 electoral votes. It's been the most important state of the last 3 elections, 2016, 2020, and 2024. What's going to happen? Well, let's take a look at Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania, in 2016, right? Pennsylvania is just like Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania is just like Michigan. It's been blue since 1988 until a guy named Donald Trump won it in 2016. So the Rust Belt states of Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, always blue since the late 80s until Trump won them all in 2016, but then he lost them all in 2020. In 2016, he won it again. It was very close. He won it by just a percentage point, by around, 40,000 votes. So that's what happened in 2016. But in 2020, Joe Biden flipped it. He flipped it back to blue. He won it by 2%, and he won it by roughly 70,000 votes. So almost around the same Trump won it in percentage-wise, right? So Biden flipped it back. Let's take a look at what happened since 2020. There was a governor race in 2020 in Pennsylvania where Josh Shapiro, the governor, the Democrat, won by 800,000 votes. That's a lot. That's a lot for Republicans to overcome in the state of Pennsylvania. 800,000 votes. Now, this guy, for the Republicans, wasn't that popular of a candidate. This guy, Josh Shapiro, has already been in politics, but that's a pretty big victory. So what else happened since 2020? In 2022, again, there was a big Senate race in Pennsylvania. The Democrat John Fetterman beat the Republican candidate, Dr. Oz, by, 300,000 votes. So that's looking good for the Democrats since 2020. Now, here's why I think Trump has the ever so slight edge in 2024 in Pennsylvania, even though since 2020, the Senate race went blue, the governor race went blue. Let's look at polling first. If we look at polling, right, in 2020, Joe Biden had, again, around a 5% lead on average in Pennsylvania, where he only won by 2. It underestimated Trump in Pennsylvania by another 3%. On average, right, this election cycle, Trump has a lead of 0.2%. So that's good polling-wise for Trump. But here's what's big. Early voting. Now, if we look at early voting in Pennsylvania, here's what does it, right? In 2020, Democrats had a 1 million vote lead in the early vote heading into the election. 1 million registered Democrats over registered Republicans. In 2024, that lead is just 300,000. Now, what I say, Biden won it by 70,000 votes. Republicans gained ground by 700,000. They have roughly the same votes as last time. It's the Democrats falling behind, right? Since 2020, I don't have the numbers up here, registered Republicans have surged in Pennsylvania, right, especially in rural areas, and ultimately, this lead would be bigger. It would probably be the lead in Georgia and Arizona in the early vote. The reason it isn't is because in Pennsylvania early voting, they do things a little bit differently. It's not just mail-in. It's pretty much just mail-in, but what you could do is also drop it off instead of mailing it back in. You can drop it off right at the ballot boxes. Where Georgia, Arizona, Nevada, North Carolina, the big leads for Trump, because Trump voters usually vote, right, in either in person more or they do the early vote in person, right? For Georgia, Arizona, Nevada, and North Carolina, those early votes, you can go in person, right? Thus, more Trump supporters voting in person. Thus, the lead for Donald Trump in the early vote. Pennsylvania, like I said, you can only either mail it back or drop it off in the ballot box. You could have it mailed and then drop it off in the ballot box. There's no early voting in person. Thus, the GOP kind of having the same, roughly the same vote total so far in the early vote. So that's pretty, that's typical. That's expected. But Democrats, a million vote lead in 2020 to 300,000. And that was mail-in, right? Like I said, early vote in Pennsylvania is just mail-in again, except, this time you could get it mailed and then drop it off in person versus just mailing it back. And that's abysmal numbers, and that's huge early voting numbers for Republicans, abysmal for Democrats. So that's why I'm giving the ever so slight advantage to Donald Trump in the state of Pennsylvania, giving him the electoral votes he needs to become the 47th president of the United States. Now, I think Wisconsin will be the close of the election. I ultimately think Georgia, Arizona, Nevada, right? And Nevada might be kind of close. That's pretty comfortable to call. I think North Carolina will be a little closer, but still pretty comfortable to call. Michigan for Kamala Harris, still pretty comfortable to call. Pennsylvania, Wisconsin are the toughest, right? Pennsylvania, Democrats in the poll, Poland not doing that bad, but like I said, in the races since 2020, the Senate races and the governor races, they're doing good. They're doing strong. It's just the early votes killing them. It's very tough to call, and Trump has ever so slight polling average lead in Pennsylvania up until this point. So that's why just barely, I think Trump will win Pennsylvania. He'll win the election. Now, if we look at Wisconsin, where, as far as my map goes, it's kind of irrelevant because Trump already won, but we'll go over Wisconsin, 10 electoral votes, right? It's just like Michigan and Pennsylvania. It's been blue since 1988 until 2016, where Donald Trump won it. But again, just barely. If we look at 2016, in Wisconsin, Donald Trump won, but just barely, by 23,000 votes. What's funny is in 2020, he lost it to Joe Biden. It went back to blue like normal, right? It's been blue since 1988. Donald Trump flipped it in 2016, went back to blue in 2020. Donald Trump lost it by 20,000 votes. So it was 20,000 each time. Very extremely close each time. Let's take a look at polling. If we take a look at polling, right? Here's why I think ultimately it's going to go to Donald Trump. Because Harris has a 0.6% lead in Wisconsin, right? On average, polling-wise. But let's look at 2020. If we look at 2020 again, underestimated Donald Trump voters by so much. Joe Biden had a 7% lead, the most on average in Wisconsin, right? And he won it. What was that? By around 1% in 2020. It underestimated Trump supporters by 6%. So that's huge for Trump because he's barely down in Wisconsin. Joe Biden was up by 7% on average, and he barely won it, Joe Biden, in 2020. Now, one last thing in Wisconsin. If we look at I actually don't have the early vote on here, but Republicans have an ever so slight disadvantage in the early vote right now in Wisconsin. Let's take a look actually at that. If we go to Wisconsin, right, they are down. Oh, it's a little bit more now. It is 9%, but I believe it was 14 or 15% in 2020. Registered Democrats had a lead over Republicans. Now it's, 9%. So they're doing better there too. Again, it's going to be close. It was 20,000 votes each way. If I had to predict, right, I think Wisconsin will go for Republicans. And there's my map. I think Donald Trump will get 297 electoral votes. I think Kamala Harris will get 247 electoral votes. And ultimately, Donald Trump will win 6 of the 7 swing states in this election, and he'll win the presidency. The big thing heading in tomorrow is this, though. I pulled it up. Is the early vote. Take a look at this. This was a few days ago, but Democrats in 2020 had a 15% early vote lead heading in the election. That's millions, 100 million people voted. That's, I don't know the math on that, but that's millions of votes. That's millions upon millions of votes lead. Whereas 2024 now, it's tied as far as party registration. Everything looking good for Republicans overall. Up until this election, you want to know some things. For the 7 swing states, Republicans looking great in the early vote in almost all the states. They're looking great in polling compared to last time. And overall, since 2020, those states, especially like rural North Carolina, rural Pennsylvania, Nevada, shifted to the right. Maricopa County, Arizona, big counties in each of those states shifted to the right. So that's why I think Donald Trump will win. Let me know what you all think. Let's go Donald Trump. 2024, MAGA.